Hello, thank you for joining this week's Washington Talk. I'm Ji Ha-ham. World leaders gathered in New York to address the UN General Assembly this week. U.S. President Joe Biden said, despite the administration's efforts to begin serious diplomacy, North Korea continues to blatantly violate UN sanctions. Meanwhile, President Biden again confirmed that U.S. forces would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion. Today, we'll discuss these and more.
어느 세계 시민이나 국가의 자유가 위협받을 때 국제사회가 연대하여 그 자유를 지켜야 합니다.
That is also why the United States supports increasing the number of both permanent and non-permanent representatives of the Council.
In the studio with me is Ryan Haas, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Haas served as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the National Security Council. And as a career Foreign Service Officer, Mr. Haas served in U.S. embassies in Beijing, Seoul, and Ulaanbaatar. Scott Snyder is also with us today. Mr. Snyder is a Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume reviews the first decade of North Korean foreign policy under Kim Jong-un. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good to have you both today.
Thank you, Jiha.
While the U.S. president accused North Korea of violating sanctions, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol did not mention North Korea in his speech. Instead, President Yoon emphasized the need for global solidarity to defend freedom. Mr. Haas, President Yoon did not mention North Korea. Did you feel that something was missing, or was it appropriate for South Korea to highlight the global issues at this moment?
Well, Jiha, I interpreted President Yoon as really speaking to two audiences. The first was a domestic audience, and the second was a world audience. And in a domestic context, my sense was that President Yoon was providing a bit of differentiation between himself and his predecessor, who focused largely on North Korea issues. And President Yoon seemed to be demonstrating that he wants to take a broader aperture to look at the priorities that South Korea must confront and that they can contribute to. And he was also speaking to world leaders who are confronting a range of global challenges. And the fact that President Yoon spoke about climate issues, the digital divide, public health, I think spoke to the moment that we find ourselves in. And I would also just note that in President Biden's remarks to the UN General Assembly, he also did not refer to North Korea.
Right. There are criticisms in South Korea that the speech was not too specific, did not provide what South Korea is going to do. So what do you think?
Well, I think the UN General Assembly is not a place to provide laundry list of details. I think that this is a forum to provide big picture views of the top challenges that the world confronts and which countries will step up to contribute to address them. So it felt appropriate for the setting that he was speaking in.
Okay. Mr. Snyder, President Yoon mentioned freedom 21 times. Some say that a previous Moon government tried to remove freedom or liberal from their textbooks or their constitution. Do you think the U.S. would view this as South Korea's return or as a positive change?
Well, I think the message of freedom, which also very much resonated with President Yoon's inauguration address just prior to Biden's visit to Seoul last May, is one that also overlaps with some of the themes that President Biden seems to hold dear, especially in international settings. And so to that extent, I think that it is a welcome theme. But I think the more important aspect of the address is really that President Yoon identified global problems and put Korea into that context. And that's a little bit different from what other South Korean presidents have done. Often what we hear is a focus on Korean issues and how that fits into the world. And I would say that for most international observers, President Yoon's approach is a little bit more understandable and digestible.
Mr. Haas, many leaders, including President Biden, underscore the UN and UN Security Council's role to resolve the current global issues. But we see Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, purchasing North Korean weapons and talking about North Korean workers to be in Donbass. Can we still expect the Security Council play an important role or to resolve the North Korean issues?
Well, I certainly hope so, Jiha, but sadly I don't hold out a lot of hope in this current moment. My general sense is that China and Russia are not in any mood right now to do the United States any favors as it relates to our top priorities or concerns. And in the case of China, unfortunately, they appear to be linking their positions on North Korea issues at the United Nations with American support for Taiwan, creating a issue linkage where really there should not be one. And given that China is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, it's very difficult to do much about it in the near term. However, I think over the medium to long term, China, through its actions, is providing a very clear advertisement of the need for United Nations Security Council reform.
Mr. Snyder, President Biden said the U.S. supports increasing the number of both permanent and non-permanent members of the Security Council. Can this balance out the Security Council and ultimately, would help to resolve the North Korean problems?
Well, it's hard to answer that question without knowing the details about who the members would be. But I think that the bigger issue is the permanent member veto, which is, I think, the source of the paralyzation and marginalization of the Security Council in terms of arriving at a consensus on issues related to North Korea. So unless that issue is dealt with, and I think it's highly unlikely that it would be, I don't think that an alternative configuration for membership of the UN Security Council would really make that much of a difference.
Charles, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that we will see in our lifetime reforms to the United Nations Security Council. And hopefully, as it reforms, the United Nations itself will be more responsive to the challenges that the world confronts.
Mr. Haas, President Yoon's meeting with President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida were very short and somewhat casual. So some criticized that this trip was a diplomatic disaster. Do you agree?
I'm not sure I would describe it as a diplomatic disaster. I think that many of the issues that people are pointing to are more process issues than an indictment of President Yoon's foreign policy. If you look at the substance of what was discussed, it was actually pretty meaningful. President Yoon and President Biden, for example, spoke about a range of issues, from energy security, food issues, climate issues, technology issues, North Korea. I think that the breadth of the issues that they covered is a sign of a growing alliance, which is what I would like to see.
Mr. Snyder, what do you think? Do you see any diplomatic achievement from President Yoon's visit to New York?
Well, first, I just want to say I'm glad that we don't have any hot mic problems here at VOA, or we would all be in trouble. Overall, I think that it's probable that the Yoon visit will be regarded as a bit of a disappointment, but I do believe that representation is important, and the fact that he was there and engaged was important. It's also clear that a number of the issues on which President Yoon really needed progress for political reasons were not really ripe for resolution at this time. And the biggest one, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very complicated issue because the Biden administration faces a contradiction between its stated strategy and the specifics of the law that was passed. And so I do think that there is a need for time to work things out. Maybe there could have been a little bit of a stronger statement from the U.S. in recognition of the importance of this issue at some of the meetings. But overall, I think that it's just a matter of the fact that the issues on which the Yoon administration wanted to make the greatest progress we're just really not ripe for making that kind of progress at this time.
Okay. Mr. Haas, it took 2 years and 10 months for the South Korean and Japanese leaders to formally sit down and talk, even though it was only a 30-minute meeting. Still, many issues are remaining, but what's the meaning of this meeting?
Well, I viewed the meeting as a bit of a key to help unlock many of the challenges that exist in the Korea-Japan relationship. Look, in a 30-minute meeting, major issues are not going to be resolved. I don't think that was the point, purpose, or objective of either leader meeting with each other. I think it was to send a signal to both governments to take a forward-looking approach to the relationship, which was clear in the readouts of both countries' statements of the meeting. And the reality is that the security experts, intelligence experts, and others in Seoul and Tokyo, they know how to work together. They know what to do. They just need political space to be able to do it. And hopefully with this meeting, space will begin to open up for progress to be made.
Okay. Mr. Snyder, the U.S. has been stressing the importance of the cooperation between South Korea and Japan for the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. If Korea or Japan keeps hesitating to cooperate, then what happened? Should we expect to see some negative consequences on the U.S.-ROK relations?
Well, the costs related to the problems in the Japan-South Korea relationship in the context of trilateralism are really about unrealized potential for the relationship rather than any specific hindrance to the ability of the countries to operate and send messages as related to key issues in the region. And so if South Korea and Japan were more on the same page, then I think that there is a lot more that could be done trilaterally to address critical security issues in the Indo-Pacific context. So that's really the problem. It's unrealized potential. It's not actually any specific cost as related to the operational functioning of issues in U.S. policy.
Mr. Haas, let me ask you about China. In 2017, China played an important role when the Security Council adopted the resolutions on North Korea in response to North Korea's nuclear test and long-range missiles. What made China change?
Well, I think that we're just in a different period right now. The overall U.S.-China relationship is different than it was before. The prioritization that the United States places on North Korea as an issue in its hierarchy of priorities is different now than it was during the Trump administration. And in 2017, this was the start of a mercurial presidency in the United States. I think China was looking for leverage points and ways to demonstrate that it had cards to play in its relationship with the United States. That condition doesn't exist in this current moment. And so we just find ourselves in a different set of circumstances, and we're going to have to adapt our toolbox given this reality.
But back in 2017, we also heard President Trump saying fire and fury, and the tension was heightened. So some say that that made China act positively. Change behavior. So what would you say to that?
I'm not sure that rhetorical statements by President Trump on their own were moving the needle for China. I think that China doesn't want to lose its privileged position with North Korea. So it was instructive, for example, that China's leader met with Kim Jong-un both before and after each of President Trump's engagements with Kim Jong-un. I think that should tell us something about how China instrumentalizes and approaches that relationship. From where I sit in Washington, D.C., it feels like we have ample problems to deal with right now in Europe, in the Global South, dealing with food security issues, energy insecurity issues, debt distress, the possibility of global recession, and now we're just getting started with climate change and a whole host of other issues. So adding the threat of war on the Korean Peninsula on top of that list feels like not the most prudent and responsible way to approach the challenge that North Korea presents to us right now.
Mr. Snyder, do you have anything to add?
Well, just going back to the issue of symmetry, I think that an unintended consequence of Trump's decision to meet with Kim Jong-un was to revitalize the China-North Korea relationship. In that context, I think that this shift in U.S. policy toward China, that really dates, I think, back to around that time. It presents a real challenge because it gives North Korea more space to maneuver. But I do think that, just to kind of follow on what Ryan was saying, there is a greater risk with all of these global issues on our agenda of North Korean opportunism at a moment of distraction. And so we need to be careful about that.
Mr. Haas, so we know China and Russia are not interested in adding sanctions on North Korea. But what if North Korea conducts another nuclear test? I mean, there must be some kind of their own red lines.
Well, I don't think that China is interested in seeing North Korea escalate tensions in Northeast Asia right now. I think all things being equal, they would prefer for that not to be the case. The challenge is what is China willing to do to prevent that outcome? I don't know if any of us know the answer to that question right now. I guess what I would just say, though, Jiha, is that I don't think that we should base our plans for responding to a potential future provocation on strong, resolute United Nations Security Council action in response. I think that we are going to have to be prepared, working closely with allies and partners, the United States, South Korea, and Japan in particular, to strengthen and toughen our posture in Northeast Asia in response to any events that may arise.
President Biden said in a television interview that the U.S. armed forces would defend Taiwan in the event of an attack from China. This wasn't the first time President Biden pledged to defend Taiwan. Mr. Haas, experts both in Seoul and Washington say that when and if any conflict occurs in the Taiwan Strait, then South Korea will be inevitably involved, and also the U.S. forces in Korea. Do you think the U.S. troops in South Korea will be sent to Taiwan in that case?
Well, Jiha, my honest answer is that I don't know, and I hope I never find out.
Okay.
The reality is that U.S. and South Korean leaders traditionally have been very disciplined about not speculating about future hypothetical scenarios in the Taiwan Strait. I think that's the right place for them to be. I think that what's important right now is for leaders in Seoul and Washington to demonstrate unity of purpose and upholding in a sort of steadfast, resolute manner the importance of preserving peace and stability and opposing any unilateral changes to the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. That's where we want to be. That's what serves U.S. and South Korean interests. On the other hand, confrontation or runaway escalation would be detrimental to both South Korean and American interests. So I would like to see us in the near term and medium terms find ways to sort of stay linked up closely so that there is a clear demonstration of unity of purpose rather than sort of searching to the distant horizon and finding areas where we may have slight differences of views on the role of South Korea in a future hypothetical military scenario.
Okay, Mr. Snyder, Japan hinted that it will support Taiwan when there's a conflict. I mean, as we know, both Japan and South Korea have defense treaties with the U.S. Will South Korea be obligated, to support Taiwan under the treaty?
Well, that's an interesting question. It is one that I think has been in the background for a long time in the U.S.-Korea relationship. Historically, in the Roh Moo-hyun administration, it was really about South Korean concern about the possibility of being drawn into a conflict. But I think that today what we have is a situation where more and more discussion of hypothetical scenarios involving conflict across the strait involve consideration of China's offensive capabilities. And as one thinks about that, it means that Japan is pretty early on going to be implicated in terms of needing to help provide support. And also in the context of the alliance with the United States, it also means that South Korean forces and bases are potentially at risk as China considers the prerequisites for any kind of successful intervention across the straits. And so it's hard to imagine that South Korea is not involved and entrapped in some way. And then I think also, if we take a look at the conflict in Ukraine, it does suggest that neighboring countries are going to be under greater pressure to be of assistance in the event of conflict involving non-treaty allies of the United States.
Mr. Haas, recently there have been concerns over the closer ties among North Korea, China, and Russia militarily. Is this a possible scenario where we see a coalition of the three, or like a semi-alliance?
Well, Jiha, as we were talking about a moment ago, as I think about the world, I think about a lot of immediate pressing challenges that we confront and that really put stress on humanity. And the possibility of an overt China, Russia, North Korea alliance isn't one of the problems or scenarios that keeps me up at night. And not because it wouldn't be a problem, but because it would not necessarily be in China's interest. China's goal, its aspiration, is to be recognized as a global leader. I think that if they were to find themselves in an overt trilateral alliance with North Korea and Russia, it would put stress on their ability to achieve that ambition.
Okay. Mr. Snyder, the Chinese ambassador to South Korea this week expressed concerns to a South Korean representative about South Korea's joining the U.S. Chip 4 alliance. What should South Korea do? I mean, can it walk a tightrope between Washington and Seoul as it did in the past?
Well, I'm not so sure that the policy under the Yoon administration really is to walk a tightrope between Washington and Beijing. Instead, what I see is on an issue-by-issue basis, the South Korean government evaluating South Korea's interests and stakes in that issue from the perspective of its own national interests. And so I think that in practical terms, what that has meant has been that if China publicly discourages South Korea from participating in the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum or participating in a grouping like CHIPS 4, well, the South Korean side is going to assess its interests and make a decision accordingly, and not necessarily worry about whether it is on the median point between Washington and Beijing.
Mr. Ross.
I think Scott captured it well. And from Washington's perspective, I think it's wise to encourage South Korea to pursue its own interests as it defines them. As long as that remains the case, I think that South Korea and the United States will have plenty of overlap of interest and plenty of opportunities to deepen and grow their alliance. Where I would grow a bit uncomfortable is if the United States were asking South Korea to act against its interest in opposing or distancing itself from China. To date, I don't detect that is the case, and with the current administration in office in the United States, I don't think that will be a problem as long as they're in power.
Okay. So my last question, is there anything China can do to press North Korea or convince North Korea at this moment?
I think we should probably have modest expectations about China taking a very active role in trying to denuclearize North Korea for the time being. To the extent that we can hold out hope, it's that China will discourage North Korea from adding to existing problems by launching provocations. In the near term, I don't think that that's necessarily in China's interest. But beyond that, I think that we're going to have to hold fate in our own hands for the time being.
Okay. Mr. Snyder.
Well, China has enormous influence on North Korea, but very little usable leverage on North Korea. And I think that ends up being the crux of the contradiction that we see as U.S. policymakers might hope for China to play a restraining role on the peninsula. And so as a result, I don't think that we should hold out much hope for China to be the silver bullet that is going to solve the North Korea problem. Instead, as Ryan suggested, we have to really think through and do this on our own to a great degree.
U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said North Korea is very likely to test a nuclear weapon in the coming months. But the foreign ministers of the U.S., South Korea, and Japan reaffirmed that a North Korean nuclear test would be met with a strong and resolute response. Mr. Haas and Mr. Snyder, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jiha.
And that does it for this week's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis.